Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and in this video we're going to look at the topic of making a team in Genshin Impact. As you are probably aware, if you've played the game, you'll know that you can have a team of 4 characters at once, swapping between them on the fly, which is useful as characters synergize with each other, with their different abilities and elements. Keep in mind, you could make any team you like and clear the majority of the game's content. This video is just to discuss some of the finer elements of team building. First up, I do have a starter guide for Genshin Impact as well, linked in the description, and there'll be slight overlap between these two videos, but if you don't really know anything about the game and want to learn, start with the starter guide. This is more of a particular topic specifically about team building. To start with, let's cover some of the different roles. Now of course there's no official breakdown like DPS, tank and healer, so we'll be a little more broad and vague. But generally speaking, I think you can more or less break down roles in Genshin as the following. Main DPS, support DPS, turret, utility and healer. Now of course, you could just say utility and healer are the same thing. Keep in mind, characters' strengths will of course depend on what weapon and artifacts you give them, as well as how you're building their talents and so on. Main DPS is the easiest to explain. This is a character who will focus on dealing damage. An example might be Razor, who's able to deal good physical damage, or Klee, who can dish out a lot of pure elemental fire damage, but no physical. Support DPS is, depending on how you look at it, a character who either supports your DPS or deals supporting damage. Xingqiu is a good example. His ability to create water swords and then swap to another character enables, for example, Diluc to trigger elemental reactions from the water swords combined with his own fire attacks. Turrets are, in effect, a subcategory of support. Fish and Albedo would be the most obvious examples for the time being, who can be built as turrets. Fish places down Oz, Albedo plants his solar Isotama down. Then you can swap that character out whilst the entity remains. Oz zaps enemies even though Amy's off field. You could also think of Goober as a turret, I suppose, and I imagine more characters will join in the future with similar abilities. The reason I subcategorize is because they are entities that are not attached to your character, like a shield. Now, utility is a tough one because tank isn't the best term, nor is just support, because there are a few aggro abilities in Genshin outside of things like, Ganyu's and Mona's abilities which taunt enemies. But in this sense, tanks can form a defensive core of your team. Usually this would be granting a shield or some other form of damage evasion. Really, you can think of it as anything that enhances your ability to stay alive and continue attacking. Zhongli with his Jade Shield is a good example, Venti with his crazy crowd control. Finally, as for healer, again, sort of a subcategory of utility, someone who heals your team. Keep in mind, these teams are, as I mentioned, very broad and one character can quite often be multiple roles, with some obvious exceptions that not everyone's going to be able to be a turret. Elemental reactions and resonance are the next thing to consider. Resonance is determined by your team. If you have 2 characters of the same element in your team, that will grant you elemental resonance, meaning you can have up to 2 different elemental resonance in your team at any one time. 2 fire characters gives you 25% more attack and raises cryo resistance. 2 water characters increases healing received and raises fire resistance. 2 electric characters means that elemental reactions will generate particles and it raises your water resistance. 2 ice characters gives you 15% crit rate against frozen enemies or enemies affected by ice. It also raises your resistance to electric. 2 wind characters decreases stamina usage by 15%, gives 10% movement speed, and shortens skill cooldowns by 5%. 2 Geo characters increases shield strength by 15%, more damage when shielded, and lets you reduce enemy Geo resistance. Finally, if you have 4 different elements, you get more resistance against all damage types. Typically, I would suggest the best thing to do is to base your resonance and build your team around your main DPS, your central character. This is also the character you should prioritize putting resources into getting their attack and damage stats up. Elemental reactions are typically scaled by the character who is triggering them. For example, let's say you have level 1 Barbara, who makes the enemies wet, then a level 90 Diluc, who hits the wet enemy with fire, triggering the Vaporize. The damage of that Vaporize will be determined by Diluc. It is the attack that triggers the reaction that deals the bonus damage. So, let's say you're a brand new player, you've not been spending any money on the game, how do you build a character with those available to you? There are two good example teams, but keep in mind that everything will depend on the specific character and player. Everything you have is going to be unique to you for the most part because of the gacha system. However, everyone has access to two okay DPS characters, the Traveler and Kaya. Let's say you're going with the Traveler as your DPS character. This is an easier one, as everyone will have the Traveler and Noelle from the starter banner, pretty much. A decent team here would be Geo Traveler and Noelle for the Geo Resonance. Then you could rock Barbara as the healer, and whoever you like for the last slot. You could alternatively go Traveler, Noelle, Amber, Xiangling for the Fire Resonance, though I wouldn't really suggest putting any resources into Amber as she's booty. And you'd also be lacking a healer. And Barbara is a good starter character because she's a very good way of applying wet. Another option, possibly a stronger one, although it's also going to be a lot more dependent on having characters, would be using Kaya as your main DPS. People sleep on this guy a lot and underestimate just how good he can be, especially if you have like his first constellation. If you combine Kaya with any other ice character, Chongyun would be best, but Diona is pretty easy to acquire too, you're going to have the Cryo Resonance. Combine that with the Blizzard Strayer artifact set, that's like 50% crit chance on a frozen enemy. His first constellation bumps that up to 70%. Let's just say, it's very easy to reach 100% crit chance on frozen enemies with Kaya. Then for your hat artifact you can grab a crit damage one and you'll be set. Naturally this means your emphasis would be on freezing people, which is where having Barbara and Chongyun comes into play. Chongyun's a great battery. A battery is someone who generates elemental energy in particles for other characters and themselves, so they can use their strongest abilities on cooldown. Then you have Barbara in there to help you heal and also to make people wet to make them freeze easier. The final slot's up to you, naturally. You might be noticing a pattern. Genshin is very flexible in team compositions. There's a lot of ways to build a strong team. You can have your favourite character and build the team around them. Team building is a very interesting part of the game, but not mandatory. But let's have a look at some of the best characters of each respective role. And again, this will probably change in the months to come as they add more and more characters. But for main DPS, Diluc and Klee are the classic main DPS since launch, and months later, they are still kinda the best. Fire is an incredible element for DPS because of how Vaporize and Melt work, allowing for incredible damage. That and two fire characters gives you the bonus attack Resonance. Xiao, Ganyu and Tartaglia are the other top choices, although in Tati's case, he only starts to shine with multiple constellations as a main DPS. But how about some 4-star options? Fish and Razor are probably the strongest main DPS 4-star characters. The Razor does need a few constellations before he really starts to get going. Fish gets big boosts at her first and last constellations too. Ningguang is similar to Fish in that her first constellation gives her a huge power boost. She's also an incredible main DPS option. Slightly harder to build in terms of artifacts and weapons. If you have none of these characters, Xiangling and Kaya are two characters everyone can get for free, and can perform the main DPS role admirably. In Xiangling's case, she'll need a crafted crescent pike to really shine, along with a physical damage goblet. For Kaya, the prototype ranker or the flute are good options, but even the 3-star weapon fillet blade can work in a pinch. Sub DPS. Ganyu is perhaps the best sub DPS at the moment. The way her burst and abilities work allow her to pop them down, then leave the field. You have to keep in mind that weapons make a big difference here though. If your character is a main DPS, they'll probably want a different weapon than if they are sub DPS. Let's look at Ganyu for example. As a main DPS you'll be using her charged attacks, whereas if you're using her as sub you want to be triggering more elemental reactions, so you're going to want something like the Stringless, which increases your elemental mastery. Mona is perhaps the classic sub DPS, as she can set up for absurd amounts of damage. Fish likewise can be built for main DPS, physical damage and attack, or sub DPS, where she focuses more on elemental mastery and reactions, using Oz. Xingqiu is situationally one of the best sub DPS, because you can use him to consistently trigger Vaporize, but of course you would want to pair him with someone like Klee or Diluc, who's, fire. Albedo, on the other hand, is the king of the turrets. Plant his Isotama down, swap character, hit enemies to trigger huge explosions. He works in any team because of that, really. As for utility, Venti was the king of crowd control. He still is the king of crowd control, and probably still the king of batteries. His burst will pick up any non-large or non-boss enemy in the game, keep them dangling uselessly in an elemental vortex for 8 seconds, whilst also generating absurd amounts of energy and doing good damage. If you have Venti, he'll be good in any team. He's single-handedly the best character in the game, in my opinion. Remember how wind resonance means that charged attacks cost less. So if you went, say, Venti, Jean, Keqing, Fish, that would be a good team because Keqing's DPS comes from spamming her charged attack. So that team has some nice synergy together. Venti's also practically a requirement for certain Abyss stages that have those stupid Defender Rock segments. You can do them without Venti, but they honestly feel like a Venti check. The other Archon, Zhongli, isn't far behind though after his buffs. Not only does he have a much cooler crowd control that consists of dropping a meteor down, petrifying everything it hits for 3 to 4 seconds, including large enemies, but not bosses, but his incredibly strong Jade Shield shreds the defense of anything near it, as well as giving you a strong defense. That, and if you combine him with other geostructure creating characters, the resonance between their structures can generate incredible energy for your team. Bennett, meanwhile, isn't the Fire Archon, but he might as well be. There is no better high-level domain healer than Bennett at the moment. His burst creates an aura on the floor that not only increases the attack of anyone standing in it by a large margin, it also heals them rapidly. It will heal, mine's healing for like 3000 a tick at the moment, but you can get it higher pretty easily. It won't top people off, as it only heals them when they are below 70% health, but in a domain, health is binary for most characters. You're either alive or dead. How much health you have doesn't really matter. Unless they are a health-dependent character, such as doing more or less damage, being at a certain threshold of health. Albedo with Harbinger of Dawn springs to mind. Bennett is definitely the best healer in domains. He can also dish out okay damage to boot, and of course because he's a fire character, this means he synergizes perfectly with Diluc or Klee for the fire resonance. But there's also Jean, who's a very versatile and strong character. Her burst is vaguely similar to Bennett's in that it creates a healing aura on the floor, and her basic attacks can heal the team as well. So she shines in domains, seeing as all of this stuff scales from her attack, so you would generally either build her for attack, or for elemental reactions and burst. If characters need to be topped off, she is better than Bennett as a healer. So if you're looking at some really strong teams, Diluc, Ganyu, Bennett, Xingqiu springs to mind. This comp feels like the most meta one for me. You get the fire resonance for extra attack, the ability to freeze, melt and vaporize, strong range potential with Ganyu, and Bennett's burst for tremendous healing and extra attack boost. You'll have no trouble with just about any elemental shield too. How about an area of attack obliteration team? You could go for Albedo, Ningguang, Venti and Fish. This would let you shred in AoE situations. You would just be obliterating everything. My current main team is Albedo, Xiao, Jean and Zhongli. Double Geo, double wind resonance. No real element reactions, just smash things until they die. I'm honestly just using these characters because I like them, but fortunately it's also a pretty good team. Albedo fits into any team, so does Zhongli. If you're pairing Zhongli and Albedo, they work great together. You might prefer Fish as a turret, as, Electro's more versatile for elemental reactions. Zhongli doesn't need a Geo character paired with him, but it helps make the most out of his structures, especially if you don't have any constellations for him, if you're poor and don't spend money on the game like me. I also have a full Geo team because Geo is just my favourite element for some reason. Ningguang, Albedo, Zhongli and Noelle. But what comps do you like? Let me know down in the comments, and I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions about team composition or anything like that, feel free to ask and I'll get back to you ASAP. Until next time though, thank you so much for watching and take care.